Hi, it is a very rainy and gloomy day, and I thought it might be cozy to sit down a little bit and chat about knitting, or more specifically about mistakes I made while learning how to knit. I think this will be helpful to beginners. I know that some beginners watch my videos. I've gotten some questions, especially about my pattern, from beginners, but I also think I have some helpful tips to share for more advanced people. And I would like to present this information more as tips and tricks rather than actual mistakes, because obviously a mistake is only what you classify as a mistake, and I'm not going to go around and tell you what to do or not to do, but I'm just going to share some things I used to do and now do differently because I find it more practical that way. And let's get started. The first tip that I would like to pass on is that when you are choosing a pattern or maybe an idea to self-draft or even a yarn, that you should always pay attention to whether you will actually want to use this in the future. I think that's something I did wrong for quite a long time. I would just kind of see a tutorial or see a pattern, and I thought the item looked cool, and then I would make it, and then I would put it in my closet and never end up wearing it at all. I especially used to do this in crochet, where I would find a bunch of tutorials for these little summer tops and bralettes, especially with the laced back, and I would make it and it would be fun to make, and then I would put it right over here and I would never take it out of there again, because I just don't really wear tops like that. And I feel like I fall for this a lot with shopping and stores as well, where I see something in a store and I'm like, oh my god, this is so cool, this would be so fun to style, but then I don't really think about the practicality of it in my real day-to-day life and what I actually want to wear and put on. I think that's important to think about with shopping as well as with making, but I think for making it's even more important because you're investing so much time, and usually if you're buying yarn for it, you're also investing quite a bit of money into it, usually probably more than if you would buy the item. So I just think it's important to make something that you would like to put on later on. And I think the same is true for the color that you choose. For example, a couple of years back I tried to make my first sweater in crochet, and I bought a very bright green yarn for it because with the design that I was thinking of, that just made the most sense. And then I made the sweater and I put it on and I didn't like it at all. There were more problems with it than that, but the color was the main problem, I would say, because I just don't look very good at a bright green. So I think when you're choosing a color for your project, maybe go with something that you know you will like. And also actually with the fiber, this is something I also used to have quite a lot of problems with. This, for example, is my first ever sweater that I knitted, or at least the first real sweater I cast on. I finished like a bunch of things in between and then picked this back up some months later. So the yarn that I chose for this is Drops Melody, and I did go with a color that I knew I would like, but this yarn is, I actually don't remember what it is, but there's definitely alpaca in it, which is very warm, and where I live it doesn't really get that cold in the winter. It gets kind of cold, and maybe a sweater like this I could put on very occasionally, but just not very often, and that's not necessarily something I want to knit and invest a lot of time into making and having in the handmade item if I can't put it on a lot. And I would also say make sure that the fiber you're choosing goes well with your skin. I know this is a little bit of trial and error probably, but for me alpaca usually is a little bit itchy, and this comes up quite high and it obviously covers everything. So if I want to wear this all day, I will probably want to wear a long sleeve under it to actually be comfortable in it, which just makes this even warmer. So I just don't end up putting it on a lot, even though I do generally like the design and the colors that I chose. So to sum up, when you're making something, always keep in mind whether you actually want to put this on later on or whether it's just a cool idea that you like. The second tip that I would like to give is don't be afraid to learn new techniques, because I feel like I come across people online here very often that have maybe even been knitting for a longer time, but I've never done lace or never done cables, and they're like somehow intimidated to try it. And to that I just want to say, I definitely haven't tried all of the techniques, but I've tried some of them, and so far I've found nothing more difficult than learning how to knit. Like if you already know how to do a basic stockinette stitch, I think you can learn pretty much every technique that is out there. It is really most of the time not that difficult, and it is most of the time also just a tiny variation to a basic knit or purl stitch. And I am certain that you can do it, especially because I find that there are so many tutorials out there for all kinds of things. My favorite channels to watch tutorials are Very Pink Knits and Nibble Needles. I think for her I like learning these kind of have the best types of tutorials. I like to go to Very Pink Knits when I just want a basic piece of information, just like one explanation, 1 minute, how does this stitch work. And I like to go to Nimble Needles when I kind of want more comparison between different types of techniques you could use to achieve the same result and the pros and cons of them. They're usually a bit longer but more in depth, and I think both of those are great channels, and definitely tell everyone and me in the comments if you have more recommendations for good tutorial channels. But generally, for everything that you might come across, there is a very easy to follow tutorial online, and once you've tried it once or twice, it is really not that difficult. I think the best example of this is the Madeline sweater that I knitted pretty recently. It is an all-over lace sweater, and I had knitted lace once before, but it still looked quite scary at first because it's such a big garment, there's lace everywhere, and you'd think it's kind of difficult. But then once I started the sweater, I figured out it's actually just one pattern repeat that is all over the sweater, and it's really not that hard if you figured it out once. So definitely don't be afraid to try something new. I am certain that you will be able to figure it out. For my third tip, I would like to dive a bit into different yarns, because what I always used to do wrong was that I chose a very random yarn that never really worked very well with the project that I had in mind. So when I started crocheting 5 years ago, I knew nothing about yarn, and also didn't really have a yarn shop close by that I could go to and touch the different yarns or talk to somebody about it. So what I would do is I would go on Amazon and I would order a yarn that I liked the color of and the price of, and that was the only two things that I was paying attention to. And then sometimes it would arrive, it would be stretchy, sometimes it would arrive, it would not be stretchy, sometimes it was thinner, sometimes thicker, and I really had no idea why or how that happened. And I only really looked into that when I started knitting, which is kind of insane to think about now because it is not that complicated, but you have to understand a little bit about yarn before you pick it. So to give a brief summary of the yarns out there are basically 3 types of fibers. So animal fibers, most of the time, will be stretchy, they might be a little bit fluffy, and they will be pretty warm. So they are well suited for all kinds of winter things like sweaters or cardigans or hats, while plant-based fibers usually are not as warm, so they are better suited for summer garments like tops. However, they also aren't stretchy, so if you want to make something more tight-fitting, you might have to look into animal fibers again. But for looser fitting summer tops, I would always recommend going for a plant-based fiber. And then acrylics can kind of mimic the look of both of them. They are easier to take care of generally, but they aren't as breathable, which is why you will find a lot of people kind of complaining about them and saying don't use them for garments. And obviously all of these fibers might be mixed and matched in one singular yarn. The most popular example maybe is a sock yarn, which usually consists of some kind of an animal fiber like a wool, and then some acrylic component like a nylon to make it stronger and more durable. So none of these are wrong, just know what you're picking when you're picking it. And the second thing that you should pay attention to is the yarn weight. I'm not going to go very in depth here, but basically the yarn weight will tell you how long your yarn is. So on the yarn somewhere there will be a measurement how many meters or yards are in there, and you can kind of compare that to how many grams you get for that. So if you get a shorter amount of meters for, let's say, 50 grams, then that means the yarn is thicker, and if you get a higher amount of meters for that same 50 grams, then that means the yarn is thinner. The fourth tip probably depends a little bit on what type of person you are, but I would say if you notice a mistake or if you're unhappy with something, always go back and unravel it, because it will upset you later on. I just know that if I make a mistake in something, and even if I know that nobody else will see it, if I see it, I will be upset the entire time that I'm wearing it. So I will unravel a million times if I have to. And my logic behind it is kind of that I enjoy the process of knitting, so I don't mind doing it again. I think when I knitted the Ivy top, I kind of came to a point where I was very upset about it because I unraveled the same part of it 5 times. But we got a finished object out of it at some point. But also, this is true for abandoned whips. I think a lot of people have those. I also have one currently that I am planning on making something else with, but we'll see about that. Where you kind of start something and then you stop working on it because you realize it's not working out, or maybe you don't have enough yarn, or you just, I don't know, lost the spark and you don't enjoy it very much anymore. And you kind of put it to the back somewhere and forget about it, and it's just never a comfortable thing to come across. And I would also say just unravel these. If you are certain that you won't pick this back up, it's fine. There's no shame in admitting that something just wasn't as cool or joyful as you thought it might be. And on the positive side, you can always reuse the yarn for an item you might enjoy making more. The fifth item on my list I also had to learn with some trial and error, but I think that's pretty normal, and that is that your body is unique and no pre-made clothing item or a pattern will fit you perfectly. So you are very welcome to make alterations to what you are making. There are some patterns that are made to measure, but most patterns have sizes. And while you can choose one depending on your bust circumference, that doesn't necessarily mean that all other parts of that size or that pattern fit your body very well. You will sometimes find designers that work better for your body and sometimes find designers that work worse for your body, but generally you shouldn't be worried about altering patterns, especially something like a length is usually very easy to alter. For example, for me, I know that the distance between my neck and the widest part of my bust is a little bit longer than for most people. So if I'm making a top or some other type of garment, I like to add some extra rows in here just so I can get enough length. Or some people have a pretty short torso, so when they are making patterns, they will usually just leave out some rows on the bottom, depending on if that works for the design, of course. And you do have to have some background knowledge about how a pattern works if you want to do this. I think something like length is very easy to start with, and obviously all other parts of the pattern are a little bit more difficult to alter. So if you're a beginner, you will probably have some failed tries here, but it is a great learning opportunity to understand how a pattern works and how what you are knitting translates into the finished garment. Tip number 6 is that you should always use the techniques that work best for you, because when I was starting out, I was oftentimes intimidated when I saw more advanced knitters online doing certain things differently than me, like holding the yarn differently or doing certain stitch types differently. And I always thought that I have to do it that way too if I want to be a good knitter. So if you haven't come across a lot of variety here, there are about a billion different ways to hold your yarn. There are a billion different ways to make a stitch. There are a billion different tools that you might want to or not want to use. And just because somebody might know more about knitting than you, that doesn't mean that their way of doing it is the correct way and you're doing it wrong. Sometimes you might be doing it wrong. For example, I was twisting my stitches a lot in the beginning. So definitely be curious when you see somebody doing something differently. Like, try to figure out why they do it differently. But I found that most of the time, it doesn't really matter if you do the stitch this way or that way, or if you hold your yarn on the left side or on the right side. Just do whatever you learned and what feels good and natural to you. I had this a lot with wooden needles. So I started knitting with metal needles only. And then when I started watching like knitting vlogs on YouTube, I saw that basically all of the more advanced knitters have a lot of wooden needles and kept reiterating how much they liked knitting with wooden needles. And I started kind of feeling like, I don't know, maybe my metal needles aren't good enough, maybe knitting with wooden needles is actually better. Usually people were complaining about how the metal needles were too slippery and stitches would just fall off them, which I actually, because I learned to knit with metal needles, find quite practical. I found it kind of annoying with the wooden needles to always have to drag my stitches around, or that the metal needles would make noise while you're knitting, but it's a tiny noise and it's never bothered me. So I don't know, I got very insecure about my metal needles, but I'm still knitting with metal needles and I enjoy it and I have good outcomes with it. So I don't really see a reason to switch. For the needles problem specifically, some yarns or garments might work better with one or the other, but you will find that specified in your pattern if it is important. My 7th tip might be kind of an unpopular opinion, so definitely let me know what you think about this, but I would say you should use more stitch markers. I find that when I'm following patterns, there are obviously stitch markers used in most of these patterns for one reason or another, but I always like to put in extra ones. I have quite a few at home in different colors, so I like to have the ones that are in the pattern in one color and then the ones that I added in another one maybe. But I find them a great way to avoid mistakes in your knitting, especially if the pattern is a little bit more complicated. So I will put a stitch marker between every pattern repeat, for example. When I knitted my Madeline sweater, for example, my lace pattern was 19 stitches and I would put a stitch marker every 19 stitches, which is quite a lot of stitch markers to have in your sweater. But I also always caught my mistake if I made one within those 19 stitches, because then at the end of the 19 stitches when I had my stitch marker, something didn't match up. So I just find it very practical, especially with things where you have to count a lot, because let's be honest, neither you or me are gonna count the correct amount of stitches like ever, but I just like to have them in there to make sure I'm staying on the right track and I'm catching my mistakes early on. My 8th tip is you don't have to be afraid to take your needles out of your work. Most of the time, nothing will happen. Most fibers are not so slippery that everything will immediately fall apart when you pull your needles out. Most of the time it will just stay that way, especially if you're working with animal fibers, they kind of grab onto themselves. It is fine. You will find your stitches again. If you have been knitting for a little while, and if you haven't, you should definitely learn how to do this. You can probably read your work, you can probably see where your stitch was and where it got lost. Obviously, when you've taken your needles out, don't move what you're knitting on a ton, don't pull on it a lot, but most of the time nothing will happen to your stitches. They will stay in place and you can just get them back on your needle. And even if they ladder down, it is quite easy to get them back with a crochet hook, for example, if you have one. If you don't, it is also possible to do it with a knitting needle. It is a tiny bit more complicated, I find. So if something is really like laddered down far, I think a crochet hook would be easier. But there are a bunch of tutorials out there for how to get your stitches back on your needle if one slipped away from you. But you really don't have to be afraid that your entire work will unravel and have holes in it if you take your needles out once. My 9th tip is be careful with blocking animal fibers. It is not the same thing as washing something in a sink. I think that's a big misconception I used to have when I started knitting, because I always saw people finish something and then just throw it in the sink and there was water and some will wash usually, and then it was dried flat, and I just assumed you would kind of just wash it. But if you're washing a store-bought t-shirt in the sink, that's a very different process, because most animal fibers can felt when they are agitated too much, so you have to be very careful with them. So what I like to do is I just put water in my sink, I put some wool wash in, and then I just throw my item in there and I leave it there for 10-15 minutes to soak up the water. And then depending on how delicate it is, I will very gently do some washing, but maybe not at all. And then to get the water out, I will not take it into my hands and pull on it and squeeze it and twist it, which is what I definitely did to this one. But I will just put it on a towel on the floor and then roll up the towel and step on that, and that will get most of the water out of there, so we'll have like a semi-dry item after. Something I also like to recommend is steam blocking. I will just take my very normal iron and I will put a wet dish towel in between my item and the iron, and I will very gently iron it, and that should kind of have the same effect of relaxing the fibers. And my 10th and last tip that is gaining relevance now that it is getting closer to the holiday season is know what you're getting yourself into if you want to do gift knits. First of all, obviously start early enough, make sure you have enough time to finish your gift knit so that you don't get into the situation where you are worried you might not have a gift for somebody. And also make sure that you're confident in all of the techniques that you're using. Don't necessarily try anything new to you for a gift knit. I definitely used to make that mistake quite a lot, because when I started knitting I got so excited and I wanted to gift everybody something knitted, and then I, for example, made a hat with stranded colorwork as my first stranded colorwork project and gifted it to somebody, which it worked out fine, but it was immensely stressful because, well, I was learning and I was unraveling it quite a bit, and then I had to go back and my deadline was coming closer and closer, so that was not incredibly fun to do. But for gift knitting, definitely also know your recipient. I always struggle to decide whether a gift knit should be a surprise or whether I want to make sure that the person who receives it actually likes it. Because obviously if you're surprising somebody with a knitted item, there's always the possibility that they don't enjoy it very much or use it very much. And that is just kind of sad for them because they might feel bad, but it's maybe sad for you because you invested a lot of time into it. And on the other hand, you could already tell somebody you wanted to make them a knitted gift and ask them about their preferences. It would still be a great gift, but obviously in that case it's not a surprise anymore. But just make sure that if you are making something as a surprise, you are considering the possibility that it will not get used very much and that you're not upset about that. And I also encourage you to think about whether the person you are giving this to can actually take care of what you're giving them. So some fibers are pretty difficult to take care of, as I just explained in the last point. Maybe if you're gift knitting, go for something like a superwash merino that is way easier to wash, and include instructions on how to wash and dry it so that the person who is receiving your gift can actually enjoy it for a long time. So that was all of the tips that I had for today. I hope you found them helpful, and you should give this video a like if you did and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more. In the comments you should let me and everybody know if you have any more tips and tricks for knitting, any mistakes that you used to make and can now share so we all can avoid them together. And I will see you next time.